A shoot shall come out, up from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, a spirit of understanding and wisdom, the spirit of counsel and might, the spirit of knowledge and fear of the Lord. The wolf shall lie down with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the kid, the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. A voice says, "Cry out." And I say, "What shall I cry?" All people are grass. Their constancy is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows upon it. Surely the people are grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of the Lord stands forever. Get you up to a high mountain. O Zion, herald of good tidings, lift up your voice with strength. O Jerusalem, herald of good tidings, lift it up. Do not be afraid. Say to the cities of Judah, behold your God. He will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom and gently lead those who are with young. These are some of the messianic prophecies from the book of Isaiah. May God add to our understanding of them through the Spirit. Would you pray with me a moment? Holy and living God, we thank you for gathering us together today to begin again the season of Advent, first season in our church year, where we wait and watch for Christ's coming again. Thank you for these ancient texts that still can speak a word of hope we need. And so now be in my words and all of our thoughts this morning, that whatever word you have for us may take root in our lives, and that we might be your people of hope, following in the way of Jesus, who leads us to your heart of love. Amen. So we've been trying something different in our church this fall. We've been preaching through the Bible with a guide being a book by the author Brian McLaren. In his new book, We Make the Road by Walking. 4 of the small groups that I facilitate have been reading and discussing and studying this book. I think the men's breakfast on occasion has lifted up a theme. And since September, we've been introduced to several foundational stories and themes of the Bible. And we've seen how this great story of the people of Israel being formed began with 2 particular people, Abraham and Sarah. And as we followed them and their descendants over 1,500, 2,000 years, we've been introduced to some stories that sound an awful lot like our own stories. Things like sibling rivalry. You don't have to raise your hand, but did anybody just have a hint of sibling rivalry over Thanksgiving when everyone's gathered at the table? Some things never change. The Bible teaches us about sibling rivalry. Remember, it only took 97 verses before Cain and Abel are in a murderous situation, the first murder between 2 brothers. And then we learned about jealousy and deceit, the drama of desire, things that are, I'm afraid, all too close to home. We also were introduced to themes like being asked to go into the great unknown. Anybody there in their life? We also heard about a people falling into slavery and idol worship, and we went, I am a slave to some things too. We were introduced to the theme of what Brian calls the drama of desire and acquisition and power. And then we heard about people wandering in the desert for a long time. Anybody there in their lives? The big theme was learning to trust God, a theme I suppose all of us see. Big metaphors for our own lives. So now, as this great story unfolds, we come to the prophets. The prophets in the Bible have a fascinating role as custodians of the dreams and the hopes and the desires of a people. And the prophets challenge the people to act in ways that are consistent with their hopes and their dreams, their best desires. And when they see people acting in harmful ways, they call the people back to God and warn them by picturing the future that will come if they persist in their harmful ways. We can still, thousands of years later, after the prophet's words were written, gain courage and hope for our own lives as we hear their words. One of the most important prophetic compositions was the book of Isaiah. Now, most scholars today agree that this book was written by at least three different authors, but probably three, over a long period of time. But their combined work has traditionally been known as the book of Isaiah, and we refer to it as if it's one person. As we follow the people of Israel, we find out that they're tired, they're weary, they are discouraged, and they're feeling frail and frightened. This is because they have been defeated by their neighbors. In the north, by the Assyrians coming down, wiping out the northern kingdom of Israel. In the south, the Babylonians coming in from the east, defeating them and dragging them down to Babylonia in exile. So they are feeling lost and confused. Anybody out there ever asked this question? Who is God? Where is God? Is there a God? This is what Israel is asking. And the prophet speaks to reassure them. With beautiful poetry, Isaiah offers a word of hope to those who are war-weary. Anybody out here war-weary? The prophet says, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, and nation shall not lift up sword against nation. Neither shall they learn war anymore. The prophet offers a word of hope for those who long for peace. Anybody out there longing for peace this day? The wolf shall lie down with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the kid and the calf and the lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead him. A word of hope to those who need some blessed assurance. Anybody out there need a word of blessed assurance today? He shall feed his flock like a shepherd. He shall gather the lambs in his arms and carry them in his bosom and gently lead those who are with young. Well, most of us have been, or are, or will be, like those Israelites, tired, weary, discouraged, feeling frail and frightened, All you need to do is listen to the news, watch it, read the newspaper. If we live long enough, we shall all be presented with situations like the ancient Israelites, saying, "Cry? What shall I cry? Nothing makes sense. All people are just like grass. Forget it." If we live long enough, we're bound to experience what the Israelites experienced. We're bound to feel disheartened and weak, faint and forlorn. It's hard to imagine a bleaker place on earth than Bosnia was in 1992. Some of us remember seeing this on television. Ethnic cleansing flourished. Neighbors forced their neighbors from family farms and homesteads that they'd had for generations. The fighting was hand to hand. It was bloody, hopeless. And by the time my husband Alan and I had become co-pastors at the Saugatuck Church in Westport, Connecticut in 1995, over 1 million people, 1/4 of Bosnia's population, were refugees. We remember seeing them on the television, long lines of people being forced from their land, carrying their babies. Babies dropped in ditches and rivers by the road because they were starving and they could not carry them any further. We began a resettlement effort at our church, and we were eventually able to offer homes and jobs for 14 Bosnian refugees. And a family, a mom and dad, young people, barely 30 years old, with 3 children under 5 years old, lived with us in the parsonage for over a year. It was one of the best experiences we'd ever had in our lives. It was then that I first heard of the protest of hope by a man named Vedran Smailović. Perhaps you heard of him. Vedran Smailović was a Bosnian. He was born in Sarajevo to a very musical family. And by the time he was 37 years old, he was the first cellist for the Sarajevo Opera Theater. But the opera theater lay destroyed now. The economy shattered, the national unity completely disintegrated. Something, by the way, no one ever thought would have happened to that great city. The very definition of human was now in question, and Sarajevo was described as the capital of hell. One day, a long line of starving people had lined up for the bakery. It was the only bakery in Sarajevo that still had enough flour to make bread. And they were all shelled, gunned down, as Vedran Smailović watched from his window across the street. The next day, hungry people lined up again to beg for bread, certain they would die if they didn't go to the bakery, and convinced that they could die if they did. And then it happened. Vedran Smailović arrived. He had donned his black suit, his white shirt, and his black tie that he had always worn when he played at the opera, and he brought with him a chair and his cello. Smailović sat down in the square, and surrounded by debris and the remainders of death and despair of the living, he began to play the mournful Abenoni Adagio. Ironically, this piece of music was the only intact score that was found in the city of Dresden that was completely leveled and firebombed during World War II in Germany. What's more, shelling or no, Vedran came back to the square every single day and played his cello for 21 days straight, the number of his friends who had been killed. Today, where he sat, there's a monument of a man sitting in a chair playing a cello. But the monument is not so much to the music, as good as it was. It is to his refusal to surrender to death and despair. It is his hope that beauty, kindness, and peace can prevail and can be reborn in the midst of a living hell. So all of us, if we live long enough, will encounter tragedy, trouble, or disappointment. It's inevitable. It's then that we too stand at this crossroads between hope and despair. Anyone who has faced deep struggle in life will know there are two outcomes. You can become better or you can become bitter. We always have a choice. And if we allow ourselves to choose despair, it will turn us bitter, making us suspicious and negative. It will lead us to ignore the very possibilities that could save us. Or worse, it can turn us to want to hurt as we have been hurt. By courageously playing his cello in the midst of humanity's warring insanity, Vedran Shmailovich chose hope. He chose to be better, not bitter. And he used the gift he'd been given, the gift of music, to be a prophet of peace. So this is our spiritual task, to feed hope, not despair. This is what the prophet Isaiah was doing. He was offering a future to a people who felt they had no future. He was offering an image of peace to a people who had known only war. He was offering the dream of a new day to those whose dreams no longer existed. Now, Brian McLaren makes a great distinction between a wish and a hope. A wish, he says, is a kind of passive optimism that says, oh, it'll all turn out okay. So I don't need to work or sacrifice or struggle or plan. But, he says, guess what happens to people who wish but never work, struggle, sacrifice, or plan? Things don't usually turn out the way they wished. So do we want a world without violence and war? Then we must work for it. Given the reality of human nature, and we have seen it from the beginning of Genesis to the end, 97 verses before the first murder. Understanding this about human nature, we know there will always be competition, there will always be aggression. But war and violence as a means of resolving conflict is not inevitable. People make decisions to use violence and to go to war. And there are other options. We can work for them. There are world courts, there is mediation, there's nonviolent resistance, there's legislation. Violence is always some failure of the imagination. Now, whether it be in Syria or Ferguson or Boulder, we can find alternatives to violence and work toward them. I hope you all saw the poignant picture that has gone viral of the white police officer in Oregon hugging the little 12-year-old African-American child who had tears streaming down his face. An image of hope in a time when we are all frightened and filled with anxiety. Remember, what you focus on enlarges. So look for those images of hope and help to create them yourself. We can begin right here in our own families, our own churches, our own community organizations to which we belong, by agreeing to resolve our conflicts in a timely manner by going directly to the person with whom we have a conflict and agreeing to work together for a solution to the problem we're having. It always amazes me at how we liberal Christians think that we can solve the world's warring problems when we can't even address problems in our own families, in our own churches. If we don't want a world where people die of hunger, then we better do something. Most programs to alleviate hunger were started by people who strategized, planned, they had a dream, an idea, and they worked toward it. Right here at home, we can get involved ourselves, as many of you are, with EFA and the community table and the Bridge House. And you know we have the soup kitchen for Sunday of every month. And many of you know, those who don't will now know, we need a new head of our soup kitchen. It's a once a month activity, and Susan and Scott Allman have done it for years now and are retiring. So I urge you to see if the Spirit might be nudging you, calling you, even with a whisper. If so, I encourage you to act on the Spirit's nudging. For Vedran Shmailovich, he was just looking outside his window. And the idea came to him to do the only thing he knew how to do, which was play his cello. When we do these things that we feel called to do, we don't know the outcome. We don't presume that we will be solving all the world's problems. Did Vedran think that by playing his cello, he would solve the Bosnian conflict? No, I don't think so. But by his action, he chose hope and gave hope to a hopeless people. And so it is for us as well. We will then, in the words of Gandhi, become the change we want to see in the world. The astute and acerbic writer Anne Lamott writes, "Hope begins in the dark. The stubborn hope that if you just show up and try to do the right thing, the dawn will come. You wait, you watch, you work, and you don't give up. When you give up all hope, you're probably only giving up the hope of getting your own outcome to happen. You're probably only giving up the hope it will turn out that you actually do have lots of power and input, and that you are secretly God's West Coast representative. You know what the difference between God and you is? God never thinks he's you. Oh, Annie Lamott. I love her point. You wait, you watch, you work, you don't give up. You do what you can, and you trust God to be God. So today, first Sunday in Advent, the first candle in the Advent wreath is always the candle of hope. And when we hear the words of Isaiah like we did this morning, it's easy for us who are Christians to equate the prophet's words with what we know of Jesus. And it's easy to see why the early Christians, when they read Isaiah, they thought it was pointing to Jesus as Messiah. To those who follow in the way of Jesus, he is God's presence. It's why we call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. He is the one who becomes the hope enfleshed for us. The one who shows us how to enflesh hope and become all we can be, the one who calls us from complacency to courage and compassion, the one who promises to be with us in all things, promising us that love is stronger even than death. It's the kind of hope that Jesus offers that propelled Vedran Shmailovich to don a tuxedo and take his cello and play on the square in the midst of bombing and death. So my question to us today is, what would it look like for us to sit in the square and play our cello in the midst of violence and chaos? Where is your square? What is your cello? For those of us who seek to follow Jesus, it is He who we continually hear calling us to beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks. It is He who is the little child who will lead us, and it is He who offers us the blessed assurance that we will be led by a good shepherd. So, though we know we live in troubled times, we don't lose hope. No, because the Word of God enfleshed is calling to us, saying, get you up to a high mountain. You are the herald of good tidings. Let people know your God is here. The prophet's hope has come and is coming, and when we offer our gifts and show up and do what we know how to do, hope is always coming. Amen.